When I first saw the listing, I honestly thought it was a typo, because no one in their right mind would list a 2-story farmhouse with nearly 2 acres of wooded land for less than the price of a used car unless there was something seriously wrong with it. But I was broke, desperate, and running from a version of myself I couldn't afford to carry anymore. So when the auctioneer answered the phone and told me I was the only bidder, I wired the money without hesitation, packed everything I owned into the back of a truck I didn't technically finish paying off, and drove 3 states over to a town I'd never heard of with a name that didn't show up on most maps and a population so small it could fit inside a high school gym. The house sat at the end of a gravel road with no name, just a bent mailbox marked with the number 88, and from the outside it looked tired but intact, peeling white paint, a crooked porch swing, and windows that hadn't seen glass cleaner in decades. But I wasn't there for aesthetics, I was there for peace, and when I stepped inside, the air was thick and stale but quiet in a way that made my chest unclench for the first time in years. I spent the first few days clearing dust, ripping out old carpet, and avoiding the basement door like it was part of the wall, because the moment I touched the knob on that first night, I heard something on the other side, not loud, not threatening, just movement, like someone shifting their weight slowly in the dark, and I told myself it was rats or wind or a loose pipe, because logic is a warm blanket when you're alone and tired and pretending your life is still within your control. But the longer I stayed in the house, the more I noticed little things, details that didn't sit right, like how the doorknobs on the second floor all turned backward, or how the light switches upstairs flicked down to turn on and up to turn off, like the entire second story had been installed upside down and no one ever bothered to fix it. One night, I found a wooden box behind the kitchen cabinets, sealed with old nails and wrapped in twine, and inside it were dozens of Polaroids, black and white images of people standing in the house, some in the kitchen, some on the porch, and some in the basement. But all of them were facing the camera except one, a man with no shirt and a stitched X across his back standing alone in the dark, his face turned away and one hand resting on what looked like the basement railing. There was no writing, no dates, no way to know how old the photos were, but the lighting and shadows suggested none of them had been taken with flash, which meant someone had developed them recently or was still living nearby. And I started wondering why a house with this kind of history would go up for auction without even a bidding war. That's when I called the auction company back, asked for more information, and the woman on the line got very quiet, then said in a voice like she was reading off a cue card, "You were advised not to open the basement. Do not call this number again." And the line went dead before I could even say her name. I didn't sleep much that night, just sat at the kitchen table flipping through the photos again and again, trying to recognize faces, trying to ignore the fact that one of the backgrounds in a photo showed the exact chair I was sitting in, down to the scratch on the backrest and the torn cushion, and I had never noticed that before because I was always looking at the people, not the space around them. That's when I realized the man with the stitch back wasn't facing away, his head was twisted fully around, his chin resting on the nape of his neck, and even in the grainy print of a Polaroid, I could tell he was smiling. I didn't touch the photos again for 3 days, not because I wasn't thinking about them, but because I couldn't look at that man's twisted face without feeling like he was studying me back, like the ink in the picture still held something alive and unfinished. So I shoved the box back behind the cabinet where I found it and tried to go back to normal. But normal doesn't mean anything when the floorboards above your bed creak at the exact same time every night, when the hallway light flickers 3 times every time you walk past it, even after you've replaced the bulb twice, and when your phone refuses to connect to any signal the moment you cross the threshold into the living room, like the air inside the house is eating data, choking reception, cutting off anything that could connect you to the outside world. On the 4th night, I finally gave in and opened the basement door, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stand the sound anymore. The slow dragging shuffle just past the bottom step, the almost human exhale that came from below like someone sleeping too shallow and too loud, and when I flipped on the light switch nothing happened. So I grabbed a flashlight and took one step at a time down that narrow staircase, every board groaning beneath me like it was waking up after a long nap. The air grew colder the lower I went, not the kind of cold from poor insulation but something denser, like stepping into water that hadn't seen sunlight in years, and as my feet touched the concrete floor, the light from my flashlight caught something carved into the far wall, dozens of names etched in messy, frantic script, most of them partially scratched out, and in the bottom corner, just barely readable, was my name written in a shaky hand I didn't recognize. The ink fresh, the scratch marks newer than the others, and next to it was a date that hadn't happened yet. I backed away so fast I nearly tripped on the bottom step, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the rest of the room and saw what looked like a small wooden door embedded into the far wall, padlocked with a rusted chain, no visible hinges, and a symbol burned into its center, a circle with 4 lines crossing through it, each ending in an arrow pointing inward like it was drawing something in, not keeping something out. I didn't unlock it, I didn't even touch it, I just turned and ran up the stairs 2 at a time, slammed the door shut behind me, and pushed the heaviest piece of furniture I could find in front of it like that would mean something, like that would matter to whatever was down there. That night I slept in my truck with the engine off, parked 50 feet from the house with the driver's seat reclined and my grandfather's old hunting knife tucked under my leg. Not because I thought it would help, but because it felt better than admitting I had no idea what to do next. In the morning I drove into town for the first time since moving in, needing to see faces, hear voices, feel like part of something that didn't hum or breathe behind walls. But the moment I stepped into the diner on Main Street, the place fell quiet, like TV static being yanked out of the room, and I turned to me at once. The woman behind the counter didn't ask for my order, just said, "You bought 88, like it was a confession, not a question. And when I nodded, she just looked at the man sitting near the window, who folded his napkin, stood up, and said, "You need to leave before you remember." I asked him what that meant, but he just shook his head and walked out like saying more would trigger something none of them were willing to be part of. I left without ordering, drove back to the house half convinced I'd overreacted, let stress and isolation cloud my mind. But the second I stepped back inside, the living room light was on even though I was sure I left it off. And resting on the coffee table in front of the couch was one of the Polaroids from the box, only this one wasn't black and white. It was full color, high quality, and it was me, sitting in that very spot, asleep, mouth slightly open. The same nightshirt I had worn 2 days ago, visible in perfect detail, and taped to the back was a sticky note with 3 words written in perfect block letters: "Do not run." I stared at that photo for nearly 10 minutes before I could even bring myself to touch it, because deep down I knew there was no possible way it could exist without someone having been inside the house while I slept. Someone who stood within feet of me in complete silence, framed the shot, captured the image, and left without a single sound. And yet the house had no signs of forced entry, no footprints on the floor, no disturbed dust, no door left ajar. Just that single photograph on the coffee table, like a message that wasn't meant to scare me, just remind me that I was being watched from somewhere I couldn't see. I checked the locks, checked the windows, even climbed up into the crawl space above the kitchen that led to the attic and searched every corner with a flashlight and a knife in my hand, calling out into the dust and cobwebs like that would matter, like whatever left that picture would flinch at a raised voice. But I found nothing, only a strange set of circular burn marks in the attic floor directly above where I had been sleeping, 3 perfect rings like someone had set down red-hot dinner plates in a triangle pattern and then vanished without a trace, and in the center was a single strand of black thread wrapped around a rusty nail. I didn't sleep that night or the next, just sat in the living room with all the lights on and my back to the wall, watching the hallway that led to the basement, waiting for something to move, something to knock, something to breathe, but nothing came. And by the 4th day, without rest, my mind started to crack, not in big ways, but in small ones, like hearing footsteps outside only to find no prints in the dirt, or the sound of my own name whispered from inside the bathroom sink while I brushed my teeth with shaking hands and foam spilling down my chin. On the 5th day, I found a new photo tucked inside my pillowcase, and this one was worse because it showed the front of the house at night, porch light on, my truck in the driveway, and me standing in the upstairs window looking down out. But I swear I hadn't gone upstairs in days, hadn't stood in that window, hadn't looked out with that expression, because the man in the photo had blood on his knuckles and a smile I didn't recognize, a kind of grin that stretched too wide and didn't touch his eyes. And when I flipped the photo over, there were no words this time, just a red fingerprint smeared in the corner like a seal or a signature. That's when I went back to town, not to the diner, but to the sheriff's office, even though I knew how it would go, even though I already felt the weight of the disbelief that was coming. But I had to try, had to say it out loud to someone. And the deputy behind the desk listened without interrupting, face blank, eyes tired. And when I finished explaining everything, the photos, the sounds, the symbols, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slow, and said, "You need to burn the photos, and whatever you do, don't open the little door in the basement." And my blood ran cold because I hadn't told him about the door, hadn't described it, hadn't mentioned its size or the symbol or the lock. And when I asked how he knew, he just looked at the wall behind me and said, "You weren't the first one to buy that house." I tried asking for more, for names or files or anything, but he stood up, opened the front door, and said I needed to go home before it followed me into town, and his hand was hovering near his belt like he wasn't sure if he'd need to draw his weapon, but he was definitely sure he wouldn't let me stay. I drove back with every muscle in my body tense like coiled wire, heart pounding with every mile, and when I reached the house I sat in the driveway for a full hour before I worked up the nerve to go inside. And when I finally stepped through the front door, I knew immediately something had changed, not visibly, not in any way I could describe, but the air was heavier, the lights buzzed louder, and the silence in the walls had a rhythm like distant breathing. And on the kitchen table sat another photo, this time taken from inside the basement, the camera aimed up at the door I had closed and barricaded, and in the corner of the frame was my foot frozen mid-step, like I had just opened the door and started coming down the stairs without even knowing it. I didn't go down there that night. I couldn't, because even though the photo told me I had already taken the first step, something in me refused to accept that I had crossed that threshold without knowing, refused to believe that something could pull me through a door in my own house without my memory catching even a second of the descent. And so I locked myself in the upstairs bedroom with the only window that faced the road, pushed the dresser in front of the door, and sat on the floor with the lights off and a baseball bat in my lap, listening to the slow tick of the hallway clock and the occasional pop of the old wood settling beneath me, pretending those sounds were just the house breathing, not something walking, not something watching, not something dragging itself across the floorboards below with patience and purpose. Sometime after midnight, I must have drifted off because I woke up to find a photo tucked into the crook of my arm. No envelope, no note, just the photo itself pressed against my skin like it had been placed there with care. chair. And this time it showed the upstairs hallway outside the very room I was in. The frame slightly tilted like whoever, or whatever, took it didn't bother holding the camera level, and in the photo the door was open, the dresser was pushed aside, and I was asleep on the floor, just as I had been seconds ago, except this version of me had something sitting beside him, a figure so faint it looked like smoke or static, legs folded neatly, hands in its lap, no face, just a blank blur where eyes and mouth should have been. And the worst part was that even in the grainy haze of the photo, I could tell it was looking at me. I didn't scream, I didn't run, I just sat there frozen as every hair on my body stood up like antennas receiving a frequency I couldn't comprehend, and I knew I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Couldn't keep pretending this was going to fade or that I could somehow outweigh whatever was slowly surrounding me. So I grabbed the bat, left the photo on the floor, and made my way downstairs toward the basement door, with every step feeling like a decision I couldn't take back. The door was closed, the dresser still braced against it from before, but the knob was warm to the touch, not hot like from fire, but warm like something living had just let go of its icons before I arrived. And I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to decide whether I was braver opening the door or walking away from it, until eventually I moved the dresser aside and twisted the knob with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and the door creaked open slower than I expected. The darkness below somehow deeper than it had been days earlier, like time didn't move the same way past the threshold. I clicked on my flashlight and took the steps one at a time, heart pounding so hard I thought it might shake the light from my hand, and when I reached the bottom I saw that the small door with the burned-in symbol was now wide open, the padlock still hanging from the chain on the floor like it had been cut with something stronger than bolt cutters, and beyond the doorway wasn't another room, but a tunnel, narrow and old, with dirt walls reinforced by rotting timber and spider webs thick enough to block light in patches, and carved into the side of the tunnel were symbols, hundreds of them, etched with something sharp and precise, and though I couldn't read them, they felt familiar, like shapes I had seen in dreams but never written down. I don't know how long I walked, just that time lost meaning the farther I went, and the deeper I moved the more I heard the whispers, not voices exactly, but thoughts that didn't belong to me pressing gently into the corners of my mind, suggesting memories I had no context for, an old woman singing in a language I didn't understand, a circle of children standing silently in a field of red moss, a man digging with his bare hands into soft black earth while something behind him watched with no eyes, and every time I blinked the tunnel seemed to stretch, expand, open into shapes that didn't belong underground. Eventually I reached a chamber, not large, but wide enough for me to stand upright and still feel small, and in the center was a chair, wooden and splintered, facing a wall covered in photos, taped intact and stapled edge to edge, every single one showing a different person seated in that same chair across different years, different eras, some with clothing that looked ancient and others that looked like they could have been taken last week, and pinned to the top of the wall was a sign written in charcoal that read, "One chair, one memory, one exit." I should have turned back, I should have run, but my feet carried me forward until I was standing in front of that chair and saw the newest photo hanging beside it, one of me, already seated, already looking at the wall. I stood there staring at the photo of myself already in the chair, already looking at the wall I was standing in front of, and every logical thought I had ever trusted began to dissolve under the weight of that impossible image. Because it wasn't just similar or staged or doctored, it was exact, down to the dirt under my fingernails, the tiny tear in the sleeve of my jacket, the crease between my eyebrows that only shows up when I'm terrified but trying not to show it. And I knew then that something down here had already pulled me into itself, had already begun the process before I thought I had even made a choice. And the longer I stood without moving, the louder the whispers became, not outside my body but inside my bones, vibrating through my ribs like radio signals bouncing against something hidden beneath the skin. And I realized the only way out might actually be through. So I sat down in the chair with shaking hands and pressed my palms against the wooden armrests, half expecting to be strapped in by some unseen force. But nothing happened, at least not right away. The air around me grew still, not just silent but dead, like the space itself had stopped breathing, and then the lights, or whatever passed for light in that place, dimmed into a thick gray haze, and the wall in front of me shifted, not physically, but like it was turning inward, peeling back into itself and revealing something behind the paper, behind the photos, behind the symbols, and in that new space was a window, not a real one, but a perfect imitation of one. White frame, clean glass, thin curtains fluttering gently as if touched by a breeze from a world that still had seasons and birds and normal hours. And through that window I saw my childhood bedroom, the old paint on the walls, the posters I hadn't seen since I was 12, the bed with the missing leg I had propped up with books, and sitting on the edge of that bed was a version of me I didn't recognize. He looked like me, but cleaner, calmer, with eyes that didn't flinch at shadows or skin corners for movement, and he smiled at me, not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly, and then turned his head toward the window and pointed to something outside. I looked where he pointed and saw the yard behind the house, the one I hadn't stood in for nearly 20 years, and there in the center of it was a hole, a deep, perfect hole surrounded by 7 stakes, each one carved with symbols I now recognized from the tunnel, and inside that hole was a box, closed but humming with a dull red glow, like something inside was alive and dreaming, and I felt something in my chest shift, something heavy and old and aching, and suddenly I remembered a night I had completely erased from my own memory. The night I woke up covered in dirt, my hands raw, my fingernails split, and no idea how I got there. I had buried something, not out of fear, but out of instruction. A voice I couldn't place had told me exactly what to do, where to go, and what to cover, and when I woke up the next morning, I had no memory of it at all until now. I tried to stand, but the chair held me, not with straps or force, but with gravity. Like the longer I sat, the more it understood me, the more it knew what parts of me could be used, reshaped, opened, and I realized too late that the chair wasn't a seat. It was a conduit, a trigger, and the moment I had accepted the photo on the wall, I had already given it permission to continue. The window vanished, the wall returned, the light shifted back to their sickly amber glow, and in front of me now were new photos, different people, different eras, each one looking at the wall in the same chair, each one with their hands clasped in front of them, as if waiting to be chosen, and above them all, a new sign had been carved into the wood with something sharp and deliberate. 7 return. One stays. I stood up slowly, unsure of how long I had been sitting, unsure of whether my legs would still respond to me, and as I stepped back into the tunnel, I felt the walls breathe outward like they were letting me go on purpose, not because I was finished, but because the next part needed to happen somewhere else. When I finally reached the basement and climbed the stairs, the door was already open, the lights in the house were off, and on the floor in front of the threshold lay another photo, this time of my father, standing in the same basement, staring at the same door, with that same look I had seen in the mirror every night for the last week. I stared at the photo of my father longer than I wanted to because part of me refused to accept what my eyes were telling me, refused to believe that the same man who never once spoke of this house, never mentioned a single word about owning land or visiting this part of the state, had stood in the exact same place, under the same flickering light, staring at the same open doorway into the earth with the same terrified confusion that had been living in my own chest for the past 6 days. And the longer I looked, the more details revealed themselves, not just the setting, not just his expression, but the way his left hand clutched a notebook I had only ever seen once in my life. A battered leather-bound journal he kept locked in his dresser and told me never to open, a journal I thought had been burned with the rest of his things when the fire took our house and left me with nothing but questions and smoke in my lungs. But now it was here, in this photo, in his hands, in this basement, and the truth hit me so hard I had to sit down on the stairs just to breathe, because everything I thought I knew about how I ended up here, about why this house called to me when I saw the listing, about why I was the only one who bid, wasn't coincidence or luck. It was inheritance, an inheritance of memory, of trauma, of unfinished patterns waiting for their next iteration. That night, I searched every drawer, every crevice, every board beneath the floor looking for that journal, hoping maybe he left it behind, maybe he knew I would find it. And just after midnight, I pried loose the wooden plank beneath the foot of the stairs and found it wrapped in a cloth that smelled like old smoke and pine sap. And when I opened it, the first page said only this: I was the 5th. If you're reading this, you're the 6th. Don't try to leave. The entries were short, fragmented, often scratched out halfway through as if he couldn't hold the thought long enough to finish. But some of the phrases stood out like broken teeth. It watches through walls. The door is not a door. Only memory keeps it dormant. They buried one alive. And then, near the middle, something that chilled me deeper than anything I'd seen so far. When the 7th comes, the house will eat again. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I read the journal from cover to cover, looking for answers and finding only more dread. And as the sun rose the next morning, I realized I hadn't heard the whispers in hours, hadn't seen a new photo appear, hadn't felt the walls breathe. And for the first time since I arrived, the house felt calm. But that calmness made it worse, because it didn't feel like peace. It felt like preparation, like the way the woods go silent before something breaks from the brush and runs at you with teeth bared and eyes wide. Around noon, I got a knock on the door. No one should have been able to reach this house without me hearing their car on the gravel. But when I opened it, a man stood there barefoot, shirtless, pale as stone, with deep scars running along his ribs and a symbol burned into his chest. The same circle with arrows I had seen in the basement, and he handed me a folded photograph without saying a word. I opened it slowly, expecting horror, expecting violence, but what I saw was worse than either. It was me, not present me, future me, older, grayer, sitting in the basement in the same chair I thought I'd escaped, hands folded, eyes closed, mouth open in a silent scream, and on the back, in handwriting that wasn't mine, were the words: one stays, one calls, one buries. I looked up to ask the man what it meant, but he was already gone. No sound of retreat, no footprints in the dust, just air where a person had stood seconds ago, and I knew then that the house hadn't gone quiet because it was done. It had gone quiet because the 7th was coming, and that 7th wasn't me. It was whoever answered the call next. I spent the next 12 hours in complete silence, pacing the floor of the house with the journal in one hand and the photograph in the other, trying to make sense of the message, trying to decide whether the roles written on the back, one stays, one calls, one buries, were instructions, warnings, or confessions. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had already played one of them without knowing it, because I had called, hadn't I, when I bought the house, when I opened the basement door, when I sat in that chair and let whatever lived beneath this place see me, measure me, catalog me like every other face on the wall before mine. And now that the call had been made, someone else would come to bury what I couldn't, what I wouldn't, what I was never meant to understand in the first place. That night, I stood on the porch in the dark with the last Polaroid clutched in my hand, the one showing my father staring at the open basement, and I waited, not because I knew who was coming, but because I knew something something was, and sure enough, just after midnight, headlights cut through the trees at the far end of the road and a beat-up sedan rolled to a stop in front of the house, engine clicking, lights fading, and out stepped a man in his 20s holding a duffel bag, wearing the same lost expression I had worn when I first arrived, and before I could speak, he looked at me and said, "I got your letter." And in that moment, I understood what the house had done, what it always does, how it uses memory like bait, reshaping time and space to draw in the next one, the next cycle, the next seven. And I looked down at my hands and realized I was holding an envelope addressed, sealed, stamped with the same symbol from the basement, and I didn't remember writing it, didn't remember sending it, didn't remember choosing him. But the truth didn't care whether I remembered, because the house had already decided, the wheel had already turned, and I was no longer the sixth. I was the one who stayed. I didn't speak as he walked past me through the door I had opened, didn't stop him as he looked around the living room and said, "It's quieter than I thought it'd be," and didn't move when the door slowly closed behind him on its own. Because the moment he crossed the threshold, the walls breathed again, the lights flickered, the photos returned, and in the silence that followed, I heard the whisper for the first time in days, no longer inside me but around me, soft and certain, saying only, "The house remembers." I don't know how long I'll stay here, or if staying even means what it used to, because my face is now part of the wall, my memory now part of the archive, and the boy who walked in holding that duffel bag will one day find this journal, read these words, see my photograph, and learn that the cycle cannot be broken. It can only be honored, obeyed, passed forward like a curse dressed in the skin of a second chance. If you're reading this, if you found this story in the dust and ruin of a house that never should have stood this long, then listen carefully and remember, the basement is not a place. It is a mouth, and it only opens when it's hungry.